We've made it to day 14, everybody. In-depth look time. Let's dive in. We're going to be talking about two very interesting individuals and some of the other peripheral people who were there during their time and influenced them and so forth. And in a way, Darwin and Freud they're alike in some ways, and they're also very different in other ways, not just in terms of their disciplines, but the very way that they went about their disciplines. So let's start with what they have in common. Why does Gaarder put them in the book? These are seemingly to us scientists over philosophers. However, as we talked about in earlier in-depth lectures, the significance of thought experimentation should never be undervalued. Part of what Darwin and Freud did was rely heavily on non-experimental data to put forward their theories. Darwin reputedly, and you could say Freud too, in many case studies, did look for empirical verification for these things in their work later on, but they first went through the information and data that was gleaned by so many other people, and they performed these thought experiments. So in a way, while they might be considered scientists to us today, they're also in a way not going by things, not doing things by what we call the scientific method today. And this is an important thing to keep in mind, to bear in mind as we move forward. Part of why perhaps Gaarder views them as cultural philosophers and scientific philosophers of a sort is they're using very philosophical methods in a way through thought experimentation and through deep diving to really understand and analyze what it is that they're looking at and comprehend it better, to use their critical thinking and reasoning skills to perform what they did, as opposed to, well, I could easily be a scientist doing experimentation, but it doesn't require of me the deepest level of critical thinking to be able to exact a new theory. So we can't attribute this quality to all scientists. And in this way, we have to think about how deeply people go into their work, how thoroughly they think about their own work, both in regards to calling them a scientist or calling them a philosopher, to properly designate them, perhaps one or the other. Anyway, what do they differ then in? Freud, on the one hand, is really going to be interested in psychology, and he'll give birth to psychoanalysis as a way of understanding better the individual. And we've seen this distinction here between Hegel, the German idealist and such, and the push for looking at humanity as a broad whole and juxtaposing that to the sort of existentialist movement that is begun and developed through Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and then later Sartre and others that we'll talk about at another time. So individualism is what Freud is really after. He's interested in the individual case, and not just the environmental factors, but the, as it were, underlying principles inside of the individual. Meanwhile, Charles Darwin is not so much interested in the individual, and rightly so, because evolution doesn't happen at the individual level. If we attribute evolution as a theory to him, we need to recognize that it only applies to populations of species, not to individuals. So in a way, they're also focusing on very different aspects of the reality you and I live in, namely population versus individual. Now here we have his photograph, that is of Charles Darwin. And I have to say, I love the beard. Charles Darwin was coming up in a context where there was still a lot of controversy, as you can imagine, 1800s, between the religious sects of society or religious sectors of society and the scientific ones. So a lot of people were still very impacted by those like James Ussher, who was brilliant, polyglot, just brilliant man, but had derived the quote-unquote accurate age of the universe to be around 8,000 years old. And how he did this, of course, was he calculated backwards based on the biblical references to the time of Jesus in the context of the biblical timeline and so forth. He calculated backwards from his present day and got something around 8,000 years. And a lot of people, you will still find people to this day who contend that he was probably correct, people who are much more fundamentalist in this way. There were others as well who simply could not imagine the possibility that human beings could be among the other species of the animal kingdom. And this was already contentious because Darwin wasn't exactly the first person to start to get this right, to posit this idea of evolution. It's not, to say, perfectly his theory. In fact, evolution had been considered as far back as Aristotle, and even before that, Anaximander had inklings of possibly an idea that all beings, including humans, all living beings, biological beings, including humans, had perhaps evolved in some sense or changed over time, transformed from moisture, which, when you think about it, is not accurate, but not all the way off the mark. When Darwin came onto the scene, already several other people had been thinking through these thoughts. And well, in fact, around the same time as Darwin, as I believe was mentioned in Gaarder's book, Alfred Russel Wallace had also had this more or less the exact same idea as Darwin at the time. And in fact, it pushed Darwin to publish sooner because he was afraid he was going to be beat out by Wallace in the discovery of this mechanism for evolution. So it wasn't so much evolution itself that Darwin gave birth to, but the mechanism that he elucidated for how evolution primarily works. And I say primarily for a reason. We'll come back to what I mean by mechanisms of evolution too in a second. So what were some of these other prevailing ideas like Usher's? Well, around the same time period, we had people like William Paley, who were still relying on this sort of teleological idea for humanity's existence, and saw God as an integral aspect of that development, namely evolution of humans, or the existence of humans. So William Paley, for instance, gave this example that if you were walking around in the woods and you came across, a rock, then you wouldn't suspect much of anything there. Rocks are pretty simple in their construction, and so you would attribute it probably to the process of nature, no big deal. However, if you were to come across, say, a watch, then you would have every reason to doubt that this is simply another aspect of the surroundings in which you're in. Nature would seem to be completely incapable of creating something as sophisticated and intricate and exact as a watch. And so this was his argument for God. This was his argument that there must be a designer, because in the same way that we would attribute that watch to something human-made, that something only a human being could possibly have constructed, not by the random forces of nature, then human beings ourselves, and in fact, all species, the eye got a lot of attention at this time. If you've never really looked at the eye before, you should. It's a very intricate, complex organ, and understanding the eye and the heart, the brain, how else could these things have come about? Certainly not by random chance, certainly by not just forces of nature, argued Paley and his followers. So Darwin was already in a very contentious time period around this, where people were fighting back and forth around this stuff. But he pushed forward. He went on his journey on the Beagle, and he came back, and what really seemed to clue him into the mechanism was observing those beaks, the beaks of the different birds that inhabited the islands that he was on, the Galapagos Islands, and in noting the fact that these beaks seemed so perfectly adapted to each of the individual things that these birds would eat, this dawned on him as very similar in the way that he would observe artificial selection, which is the process by which we have domesticated cattle and pigs and dogs and cats. We interbreed them, and changes start to come about, but they also, when we breed them for specific changes, such as more milk production or anything like that, well, what's the explanation there? It's a selection. There must be a selecting mechanism. In artificial selection, we're the mechanism, we're the selectors. What explains then things at a broader scope? natural selection is the mechanism he proposes as being the primary but not the sole factor in how evolution works. So what I mean by a mechanism of evolution is that there are aspects of how evolution works, how change itself works, such that things are selected for. But natural selection should not be misunderstood then for the only thing that is at work here. Part of why there might be so much confusion around Darwin, and not just by the lay people, but by academics as well, is that it's very easy to overemphasize what he attempted to impart on us, which was this important mechanism of natural selection. When in fact, there are many others. There's gene flow, there's genetic drift, there is non-random mating or selective mating styles. There's mutation itself within the genetic code. These are all also mechanisms for evolution that work in cooperation, you could say, or together with natural selection to create the things we see in the world, but are not based on natural selection alone. Nonetheless, Darwin seems fairly right about this one thing, that most of what can be held responsible for most of the phenomena, most of the results that we see in the world, is indeed natural selection. Now, Darwin was taken up and by many people, and people who really, really admired him include no less than Marx himself. Marx actually attempted to reach out on several occasions to Darwin in an attempt, I think, to start a chain of correspondence. And for the most part, Darwin, if you replied to him at all, mostly ignored his advances. Marx was infatuated with Darwin, and it seems that would have probably complemented his idea of communism and such as well. But along with that came other individuals like Herbert Spencer, who was also among these European geniuses, but also gave birth to the idea, coined the phrase survival of the fittest, among other things. If you associate survival of the fittest with Darwin, you're actually missing Darwin's main point. He did not say survival of the fittest. That was Herbert Spencer who coined that. Herbert Spencer is also responsible for what we call social Darwinism. And that and the topic of eugenics could take a whole nother lecture to explicate, but the main point here is that social Darwinism took the idea of natural selection and said, not only would it appear that natural selection favored humans above other animals, for look how many different modalities, different environments, and so forth that humans have managed to conquer and survive in, not only would natural selection appear to favor human beings, but even within the human race itself, we can see lots of different races, and some races would appear to be superior to others. This is obviously a completely false and backwards view, but this was born by the same mind as coined the term survival of the fittest. So people have misunderstood time and again what Darwin actually meant by his work. One way we could characterize natural selection, rather, and this is the more popular cliche way of saying it, is rather survival of the fit. The point is to do, well, let's just say if you are trying to pass a test and you make at least 80%, you pass the test, versus someone who maybe got only 60%. Now, passing the test is all it takes to remain in your class. You don't have to make a 99% or 100% in order to remain in your class. We get this very intuitively when it comes to education. In a way, this is how nature works too. As long as you hit that something around 80% mark, then you are, your species, your lineage is almost guaranteed to survive. So we don't need the fittest, we just need the most fit genes and adaptations to environment in order to live in it and thrive. As you can probably imagine, this was something that also fed the Nazi party as well. Nazism very much relied on the concept of eugenics in order to carry out its proposals. That is, that there was a more legitimate race, the Aryan race, certainly over other races, over other races, and most certainly over the Jewish race. And so, again, time and again, we see in history these philosophical concepts being abused and misused no less Darwin than Marx, I suppose. Fast forward to the modern day, and we still have some of these misinterpretations cycling around, and we even have whole movements that are based on these misinterpretations, such as universal Darwinism, which claims that pretty much everything in terms of evolutionary change relies primarily, if not completely, on the mechanism of natural selection. We have to be, again, super careful about how we go about these things, but I was a big fan of Richard Dawkins for the long time. I still love the guy, but and The Selfish Gene is an incredibly important reading for biology and genetics. But we need to also recognize the limitations of reductionistic thinking. So one thing that Gaarder wants to be sure to point out to us is the fact that Darwin was a naturalist, and along with Freud in his own way. Now, what constitutes naturalism? Says the Oxford English Dictionary, naturalism is the idea or belief that only natural, as opposed to supernatural or spiritual laws and forces, operate in the world. That doesn't mean, of course, that one doesn't necessarily affiliate with a religion or have specific beliefs in the supernatural. It rather says, kind of like way back in the earliest inklings of pre-Socratic thinking, those, you could say, those were the naturalist philosophers. We call them that for a reason. Rather than rely on supernatural explanations, we rely on the ones that we are capable of observing and experimenting with. Let's see an example of how natural selection works. Again, because it would be too easy to think that it's simply about being the better species, as opposed to you could say almost a sort of bilateral negotiation between environment and species. This is the most frequently commented example. Can't remember if Gaarder had it in his book or not, but we'll mention it in brief here because you can find examples in every single evolution course or genetics course perhaps on the planet. This is the case of the peppered moths. So back in the 1800s, when the Industrial Revolution was taking place, England was going through this dramatic change in environment too, because so much soot and ash was being produced during that time. And one of the clear observations of how this was affecting the natural world was in the case of the peppered moths here. So we can see up in the top here, this is, let's say this is time 1. This is prior to the revolutions taking effect. And the peppered moths, I don't know if you can see very well, but you can see that there are these sort of lightly colored gray moths, and then these darker gray ones. Now, if you're a bird, you are going to look at the bark on this tree, which is a nice light colored gray. Perhaps it's a hackberry or an ash, who knows. And we can most likely pick out these dark gray moths over the light gray moths. So you're going to eat those. And so the dark gray moths are very low in population compared to the light ones. However, post, or certainly in the peak of the Industrial Revolution, the soot that started covering the bark of the ashes made a dramatic difference for this species of moth. Suddenly, the dark-colored moths had every reason to be better camouflaged compared to the light-colored moths, and here Mr. Bird is going to come in and eat the light ones. So now the light-colored peppered moth population is going down, and the dark one is rising. And this is due partly to what would seem to be random, at least to these moths, these random forces. But this is what we mean by selection, that the environment itself is in the process of selecting for certain species over others. It is not that each individual grows stronger, that if I work out more, that I'm going to pass off my workout genes, my buff genes, which I'm not, but even if I could be, even if I were the Schwarzenegger of my family, to pass those off to the next person, and our lineage therefore will become stronger and stronger over time. The most likely thing that could happen is if I were to push for a culture of working out, then perhaps my family would be in better circumstances to survive, say, an Armageddon situation or something like that, and then we would perhaps continue our lineage. But it wouldn't be for any reason other than the fact that the environment saw the adaptation for that particular feature to be advantageous over the other, if we want to, of course, personify nature for a moment. So this sounds good, right? Here we have the answer. This seems to be exactly what human beings always needed to hear. It turns out we're part of the animal kingdom. And it turns out that our descent from the great apes, which is one way that it was presented, the descent of man, by Darwin, that this descent has a very naturalistic explanation, and we know our place in the universe now, right? Not quite. Just as I was saying, lots of people could go the other way with that. Herbert Spencer had his own interpretation of what that meant, and his was not so far either from the work of Ernst Haeckel, who was an avid Darwinist and brought a lot of Darwin's work into Germany himself. Here we see a page from his Evolution of Man, and I want you to really just take a nice deep look at it and tell me what seems wrong here. Other than the fact that by man, that seems antiquated now. We would normally say human, or human beings, or Homo sapiens, Homo sapiens sapiens. But besides that, what else seems wrong, just generally, structurally speaking? Hopefully you can very quickly pick out that in this so-called evolutionary tree, human, or man, stands at the very, very top. And we have to wonder, what exactly promotes this idea other than the perspective of the people, the perspective of the one creating this tree? Down at the very bottom, we have all the primitives, if you will. The Monera, the bacteria, the zoophyta, the worms, and so forth. And so what we have here is a very interesting interpretation of what seemed like a decentralizing thing, but ultimately is some of the same in meaning. It was no less of a Copernican feat in the way of evolution to imagine that human beings are just one among other species of animal, of living organisms on the planet. In Copernican's time, we on the Earth had to be taken out from the center of the universe and instead placed as just, living on this ball, another planet that circled the sun. It was a decentralizing move. It took our anthropocentrism and said it's not so founded as that on correct thinking, or at least on accurate observation of our place in the world, scientifically speaking. So what should evolution in part be saying to us is decentralizing humanity from the epicenter, the essential core of evolution's drive. It would be an important aspect of this theory as well. And while Darwin may or may not have also felt this way about it, the important thing is that we today still very typically misconceptualize it. We still give a lot of priority to what I think is ultimately a privileging of complexity. See, there's no doubt that human beings have an enormous amount of complexity compared to certainly prokaryotes or single-celled species of bacteria. But, to, of course, perhaps even a lobster in some senses, depends on what you mean by complexity. But our brains, we have gone as far as to believe, are the most complex things in the known universe. And so what we've done is we've seemed to prioritize that complexity and say human beings are the pinnacle of evolution. We always, even in these very cliche versions of the evolutionary man, you see the fish coming out of the water, and then the ape walking on land, or whatever, rat, and then the ape, and then human being, and so forth. It still gives the impression that there was some sort of teleological significance to evolution in bringing us about. It doesn't really it doesn't really rely as heavily on naturalism or non-teleological thinking as we might like to admit. If you still feel in yourself some sense that, well, yeah, human beings really are the primary dominating species on the planet, then this would be a very important aspect of the theory to to get your head around. As it were, if we did undergo some sort of Armageddon, the most likely surviving species are bacteria, not human beings. Bacteria have lived way past our time going backwards and are likely to live way past our time going forwards. So what is the most dominating species seems to rely a lot on criteria that we established for ourselves. And complexity may not be the best criterion for that. So the more correct way of viewing the work of biology and evolutionary theory today is to posit something more in the lines of this. Here we can see this as the phylogenetic tree, sometimes called the tree of life, not to be confused with the Kabbalic or religious versions, but the tree of life in biology. And you can see that if we look at all the diversity of life on this planet, from slime molds to protozoa to the majority of them are in categories that we don't even probably feel that familiar with, spirochates. And then even as we get closer to where we are, we see algae and plants and fungi. Finally, we have animals, and we are some tiny branch of a tree that could also almost infinitely seeming, of course it's limited in reality, but infinitely seeming branch out into the hundreds of thousands, hopefully still in this day, millions of species of animals that are out there. So we are small. We are in fact very small on this map. And even among our own species, we tend to forget, only recently has this become a more popular thing to think about, is that there have been multiple human species even. That what we think of as the pinnacle of man or the pinnacle of human being is also characterized by this one little branch up here, Homo sapiens, which was part and parcel of a number of branches, Denisovans and the Neanderthals, which we may have bred with as well, in addition to branched off from the Heidelbergensis, and we've discovered Java man and Peking man, not immediate links, you can see, to the original habilis or erectus, but nonetheless a separate branch.
These earlier skulls, found in China, have baffled scientists until now. The new human, they say, was the last in line in the evolution of long-lost ancient relatives in Asia that we've only just found out about.
So these were coexisting at the same time, and only most recently did they appear to, for the most part, disappear or become all just sort of one species, which is of course defined by the ability to reproduce together. So we have to update our thinking if we want to really take on this project of in the same Copernican fashion, truly Copernican fashion, of not putting human beings back in the center, but rather decentralizing us from our privileged, self-posited, privileged place and standpoint. Another important development and problem that has come up through this theory of evolution has been the problem of reductionism. Let me get really clear what I mean by that. The act or position of assuming one theory or phenomenon to be reducible to some other theory or phenomenon, according to the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Reductionism is not inherently bad. We reduce things in science all the time for good reasons, in order to try and establish basic efficient causes for the things that we see in our world, or at least the observations that we make and experimentation that we put forth. But reductionism has some real downsides too. So, for instance, the recent fixation that we've had on the DNA strain and on its composition of amino acids and so forth, the structure of that chain, and RNA also is an important part of this picture. The way that we have prioritized genetics to be such an almost completely fundamentalist base on which everything else is built, at least as far as we're concerned, for both life and humankind. This prioritization is markedly leaving out so much of the broader picture of what it means not just to be human, but to be a living being or to even exist in the world, that we have to wonder if we're not doing as much damage by over-representation of specifically genetics within evolutionary theory as we are other, not just other sciences, but even other expressions, artistic or otherwise, of life. And now it is time to move into Freud. Freud is is such a controversial character in so many ways. Perhaps only a bit less so than, say, Marx, for instance, for a lot of people. Most people, not everybody, but anyone who's gone out of their way to actually read Freud, I think has a much greater sympathy for what he was trying to achieve, and really has achieved. I shouldn't say trying, because has achieved. There are a few other things that you are absolutely required to be sure to understand in medicine today than the theory of personality and things like the libido theory that he created. As far as Freud's personal background itself is concerned, he was Jewish, and so he was targeted for a while by the Nazi Party during that part of the war. And he also was actually not per se a psychologist in the way we tend to think of it today. He was trained in neurology. He was actually a very gifted neurologist for a while, and he started getting deeper and deeper into hypnosis and found that there was something about the way that we characterize people in their psychoses and their psychological problems and dilemmas that needed some explanation. So what was the characterization? At that time, the most that psychologists or people in the discipline could do, especially neurologists and such, is emphasize the importance of a healthy body. They would say if there is something psychologically wrong, it's probably mostly that there's something physically wrong with you. And if it could be treated physically, it was. If it was impossible to do anything about, perhaps due to the limitations of technology or just, looking in the wrong place altogether, then they would simply have to wash their hands of it and say, sorry, nothing could be done. And Freud was very unpleased with this. He felt like there had to be something. And in exploring hypnosis and other things, he realized that while hypnosis wasn't ultimately the answer, that there was a lot to learn from that process over the many years he tried it on with clients, with patients. There was certainly something to get out of it. And one of the things that it helped him recognize was that we tend to, or at this time especially, we tended to treat everything as conscious phenomenon, when in fact it isn't. Go back to Romanticism for a while. Remember when we were talking about the unconscious versus the conscious? Now, at that time, the unconscious was representing, as it were, nature and all the things that are quietly seething beneath the surface of humanity. But that was two things. That was first very collectivist thinking in the sense that it's humanity and nature. And secondly, it wasn't positing that unconsciousness within humanity itself, within the human beings itself. And this is Freud's brilliant move, was to recognize that in the individual human being, there are these at least two aspects, potentially three. One is the conscious, the second is the unconscious. That is, there are aspects of our very selves that are completely outside of our awares. And when I mean completely, says Freud, outside of our awares. So that's why sometimes we even recognize something called the preconscious, which is this place where we maybe with enough effort and due diligence can recall some memories or dreams or things like that seem to be outside of our consciousness, but ultimately, if we try hard enough, we can recall. This is not the unconscious we're recalling it from, however. The unconscious really is beyond what we are capable of penetrating. And the most that a psychologist or psychoanalyst, we should say, can do, says Freud, is help with trying to allow those undercurrents of unconsciousness to possibly approach this level of preconsciousness and then elicit from that what sort of disturbances to the ego, to the self, are at work that explain the psychoses or neuroses that we're experiencing. Now, this is the typical iceberg model, and some people represent it slightly differently, but this works pretty well, I think. And do you remember how I said earlier how German capitalizes all of its nouns? The one thing it doesn't usually capitalize are pronouns, and that includes I, ich, for instance. However, this is part of how Freud actually ended up using these words to talk about this very process. So the theory of personality is comprised of the Ich or ego, the Über-Ich or superego, and the S or id. And S normally means it in German. And he capitalized these, and it made it possible then to actually talk about them and use them as these sort of objects in a way for theory work. And so what does the Ich or ego represent? It represents the self that is going to develop over time following childhood. And it's essentially the id or S, the id that is interacting with the environment. And as we come to recognize that there's an inside and an outside, we immediately start to establish then the presence of an I or an Ich or an ego. What's the superego then? The superego, according to Freud, is what develops when the ego or I begin to, well, not just begin to, but have started to solidify my understanding of how the world works. And a huge, I can't probably overemphasize how much Freud probably believed this to be true, how much the parents of a child are part of that process. So parenthood makes a really huge difference to the development of the superego. The superego is constantly at battle with the id to attempt to reconcile what specific drives for wish fulfillment are worth actually executing or not. That is, what is good and what is bad, or what is right or wrong to do. My younger brother and I used to joke around. We'd sit in a huge theater. Perhaps it would be a performance, or perhaps it would be a graduation ceremony. But regardless, we used to just start this giggling fit. This happened as much as we were older as when we were younger, because we knew what the other person was thinking. This giggling fit over the idea of one of us just jumping up and shouting some sort of just completely irrelevant expletive, or maybe even like throwing something just over the crowd, just completely making a complete arse of ourselves. Now, the whole point is that there's something that represses that thankfully represses that from taking place, or else we'd have a chaotic mess. And the giggling was, in a way, part of our releasing of that force of repression that was battling with the force of desire, the desire to do something absolutely ridiculous. So the idea is that we're undergoing these all the time, and sometimes they're more conscious seeming, but at other times it's very clear that it's a very unconscious process, that there can be stuff that is going on under the surface, and the only way you have any sense of whether or not there could be something, a form of repression that is overexerting itself and trying to prevent this unusual development of specific wish fulfillments and so forth that are above the normal threshold, above the normal amount. Where do they display themselves? It displays itself in symptoms, in psychosis or in neurosis. Now, for Freud, for psychosis, it was a matter of this, environment and myself, the ego and the environment sort of problem. And neurosis had much more to do with the superego's involvement. But never mind that. The main point is that if I have a tic, one of these, or I have something about myself that is much, much more severe, perhaps Tourette's, or perhaps absolute, almost psychotic seeming episodes of tyrannical fit that seem to come from nowhere, then those are symptoms, in this early theory of psychoanalysis, symptoms of things that are going on underneath the surface that are being repressed, but are also in that attempt to exert repression over a very difficult force, the force of the id that is more powerful than it maybe ought to be, ends up complicating the physiology of myself and my emotional stability, and results in these episodes. So what do most people have a problem with when it comes to Freud? It often has more to do with the libido theory he started developing as well. What Freud started noticing in so many of his cases is that the ones that had the greatest amount of obvious symptomhood were often linked to some sort of sexual episode, some sort of repression of sexual drives and so forth. And he found that this was true not just of adults, but for children. And it's true from early development. Children do have an inherent interest in understanding more about sexual behavior. We just have to decouple, though, our notion of what we mean by that. Sexual behavior doesn't necessarily mean anything having to do with sexual intercourse. It doesn't even necessarily have anything to do with the genitals or reproductive organs whatsoever. It mostly has to do with how we, being male or female or having a sex, are oriented in the world toward ourselves and toward each other. And we have a mother and a father, and it's very clear to us from an early point as children that they are of often, not always, different sexes. I know that could seem contentious, but keep in mind that we're just dealing with it in terms of natural reproduction at this moment, meaning literally requiring a male and a female to complete. It would be interesting to continue to look into all the cases where, in fact, such as in the modern day, there are same-sex marriages. Moms and dads are not always what they have been in the past, but adoption and such makes also for a different situation, perhaps. Maybe not altogether different, but somewhat different. Anyway, but if we just keep in mind that the point here is that there is sexuality in the world, and we as individuals will have to contend with that at some point in our lives, actually throughout our lives, says Freud, from childhood onward, then we are going to go through these different stages, from anal to oral to phallic and so forth. We will have to go through these stages in order to grapple with the difficulties of our being in the world as such, wanting on the one hand to fulfill certain wish fulfillments. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean have sex, but to recognize that the pleasure principle is an important aspect of this, and so to recognize certain pleasures as happening, that could be just a first kiss, or it could have nothing to do whatsoever with touch, could be just the look of another in one's eyes. It could be a number of different things, and that this desire and attempts for wish fulfillment are either successfully undergone in the process of our lives, and in other cases they're not. And when they're not, those are the cases where, again, where the collision between the id and the superego and the mediating ego trying to do its best around that, on what to do around this, are ultimately resulting in these symptomatic issues that we occasionally come across. And it could be something more benign, like certain habits or fixations or addictions. Not that addictions are anything to laugh about. Or it can be something more severe, which is overt violence and patterns of more aggressive, violent behavior. So what is psychoanalysis per se? Psychoanalysis, again, by the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the method and theory of generating a more stable state in the mind by excavating and resolving unconscious repressed conflicts. Now, we have every reason and way to interpret this now that we have a better sense of Freud. However, psychoanalysis doesn't end there in the discipline of philosophy. So, following Freud, we had a couple of other interesting individuals. One of them was Lacan, who's up here, who I'll get to in a second, actually coming much later. During his own time, Freud had probably his best known and certainly most prominent student at the time was Carl Jung, who was an avid Freudian for a long period of his life before he eventually turned away from Freud and decided that there were more collective aspects that needed explanation. So Jung is best known for things like the collective unconscious, by which humanity is united in some way by an unconscious that's not just individualistic, but resides at some lower level even than that, and connects us in some way to each other in the least conscious or least aware aspects. But we see evidence of it in things like archetypes, which he was a prominent advocate for, and in explicating, in explaining away even to some extent. And he also saw it in the way that different cultures would come up with similar themes and storylines and religious rituals and so forth. So he saw in his mind lots of evidence for this collective unconscious, and there's a large number of primarily, we'll talk more about New Age and New Ageism later on, but a lot of New Age theory has also taken up more Jungian aspects of psychology, certainly more than Freudian. So we're going to touch on briefly here Lacan. Now, Lacan, more through the 60s and 70s, would not have labeled himself a psychiatrist or even a psychologist. His work, he felt, pertained to something greater or deeper, perhaps in some way, than psychology. He's a very, very difficult read, intentionally so. Made it very, it was an important focus of his own work to make the language nearly impenetrable. And part of the reason why was, as many postmodernists tend to do, they might be trying to push the envelope in order to try and make their work a thing you have to work to grasp. But the basis for Lacan's work is in Freud. And if you ever do go into philosophy today, you will most likely be charged with reading him at some time or other. He's known for his complicated diagrams that seem almost like mathematical apparatuses. One things I can impart to you about Lacan very briefly is that he's known especially for these sort of three aspects of our world. And this is something that is hard to grasp entirely unless you understand that psychoanalysis takes as the primary, you could say the primary constituent of the world, the subject. That is, our main concern in psychoanalysis is the subject, as in not the subject of the sentence, but the subject versus object relation of my experience. The subject is most of what we're concerned with then in psychoanalysis. And so Lacan brings up these three main aspects: the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. And I've heard it compared to, say, like a chess game, although this is obviously a massive simplification in what he's really trying to say. If you think about the chess game, you'll notice that there is, or chessboard, the pieces and the board itself are made of a material that we might call the real material. It's something, though, much deeper than just the pieces and board themselves, but something we can't even actually see or investigate without breaking open, and even then we'll never get at every aspect of the real. And this, in a way, is characteristic of his version of the real, although much more so, much deeper in than that. He goes as far as to say the real is, in a way, the depending on how you wish to read him, the irrational, the least reasonable aspects of the world. It's what we cannot, as it were, like a rationalist, really investigate by reason the reality of our world. And this real is something that encroaches on us nonetheless, and seems to, with any sort of natural disaster or life event that is just completely capsized where things are going for you, might be an exercise in exploring Lacan's version of the real. Going back to the chessboard then, the imaginary aspects would be what we can see in the pieces themselves. If you look at chess pieces, you'll notice they resemble the knights, the queen, the king, the rooks, and there's this even sort of battle going on. You could say an imaginary battle. And the imagery and imagination, that is the process of imagining, the imagination of this as sort of our way of also getting around in the world, as it were, and having certain images, as it were, before us that are not just mere resemblances of mom or dad or brother or wife or cousin, but are these images that we're constantly having to interact with, that we are as much responsible for, if not more responsible for, than the people themselves. Not just for people, but for most aspects of our lives. And then finally, you have the symbolic, which is, if you think about it, the way that the chess pieces move in order to, you have certain rules and such by which you are supposed to go about in the world, and not break certain laws, not do certain things. Think again of the relation between the superego and the id. And these are all following then this sort of symbolic order of how things need to be performed. And you cannot win a chess game and not perform by these rules. You cannot be successful in a life game without following certain rules as well, is how this could be characterized. Another way of characterizing these three aspects is to think of the real as having a lot to do with what we perceive of the world, the imaginary as being those sort of traces of such things and additional fantasies and whatever that we might actually produce in our own minds. And then the symbolic as being the languages and the cultures and symbolic systems or structures that hold us to performing and thinking in certain ways. All of this has been oversimplified in a way and would require so much more investigation by someone of interest to understand more completely. But among the other things that are worth looking into are the mirror phenomenon, as Lacan is also regularly known for, that when we stand in front of a mirror as babies, at some point along the process, we eventually recognize the self. It doesn't have to involve even a physical mirror, but it has a lot more to do with the way that we interact with the environs and with other people that brings about the formation of the ego in the first place. I highly recommend that if you've gotten a good fill of Freud, that you then consider looking at Lacan, if only to be familiar with him prior to finding him elsewhere in the world, especially in philosophical departments today. The last thing I want to touch on before we wrap up for today is Goethe. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe could be rather trivially, in a way, equated with the sort of Shakespeare of Germany. What matters our creative endless toil when at a snatch oblivion ends the coil? Truly a master genius. He worked as much in the realms of science and other such disciplines as he did in literature. He's known for such incredible pieces as Faust, which you can still go to productions of today in the theater. Goethe is easily someone who also deserves a lot of investigation and exploration of, especially, I think, in terms of literature, and to look at the way that he attempted to understand light and optics and the sciences too is worth an investigation, so be sure to check him out when you get a chance. Next time, we'll be taking a broad sweep of philosophy today, getting a good grasp on what to expect, references to, what sort of philosophers are prominent in our world today. We'll say more then next time.